Well, actually, that's a good question. Even the more pertinent thing is why politics. I think in the book I state that even though I take a general interest in politics, I've taken pride in never having been elected to any office in my life. And the few times that I have moved up the ladder, they've been more appointments rather than elections. So you're right. Why interested in it? Actually, this book derives from a prior study that I did some years ago having to do with the most creative people in the 20th century. And that book eventually was published, and that was called The Price of Greatness. I dealt with 18 different professions in that book. Politics was one of them, but there were many other professions: science, art, musical composition, dance, and so forth. And even though I looked at a very large number of people in that study, one of the professions that puzzled me the most was politics, because there were a number of great leaders there. And after I completed that project, I got wondering more and more, what is political greatness? In almost all the other professions, there's something tangible you can go on. A scientist does research, he publishes his work. An artist performs, an athlete performs, a businessman makes money, products, and so forth. What is it that a politician actually does? And, what is the product, the work product? And in many instances, some people will say this political leader is great, and in other instances they'll say he's terrible. So how do you measure political achievement? What is political greatness? That's how I started the study. And what I did was to look at all of the world leaders in the 20th century, of every single country in the world. Right, good for you, yes, and 199 countries. I looked at all of them, and I collected information on all of them. But what I did was to home in on a subgroup of them as well, 377, about whom there was much more information available about their personal lives, about their achievements, about how they gained power, how they lost power, about their families, that type of thing. And from that information, the book evolved. The University of Kentucky Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Oh my goodness, I can't count that high. I've been there since 1970. Yes, I'm a physician. I'm a professor of psychiatry. Oh my goodness. I don't know. I started off medical school thinking about surgery and thinking about general practice. And somewhere along the way, maybe in my third year of medical school, the University of Pennsylvania, I sat in on a lecture, one of my first psychiatry lectures, and it's like falling in love. You just see somebody and something clicks, and I just knew the field was for me. So that's how I ended up in psychiatry. Well, it says that there is a relationship between political leaders and other primates. And this is a particularly whimsical portrait. It's done by Donald Roller Wilson. And it says, I believe, a lot of some of the conclusions that I came to in the book. Well, before I give them to you, I really need to explain how I came to these conclusions. When I first started this study, I had no idea at all that I would be making a comparison between political leaders and other types of primates, chimpanzees, baboons, monkeys, so forth. But as I got into my work more and more, a number of questions began emerging that I could not answer, that puzzled me. For example, why was it that there were so few women rulers in the 20th century? There were a total of 27 out of 1,941, which the percentage was 1.4%. And of those, half of them, at least half, were either wives of some famous politician, they borrowed their husband's charisma, or daughters of him. And so that left, if you look at just women who have made it on their own, that was about 0.75%. So the chances of a woman becoming a ruler in the 20th century were less than 100 to 1 odds, over 100 to 1 odds against it. That puzzled me. And the reason it puzzled me was there are very many very brilliant, competent women. And surely many, many more should have been able to have maneuvered themselves into positions of power, despite a lot of social constraints and cultural constraints and that type of thing. So that was one thing. Another thing that puzzled me as I looked at many of the world leaders, and this was a surprising finding, was that one could become a leader, the most powerful position in the country, not being very bright. Many of them were illiterate. Many of them were frankly crazy. And even a number of them were demented. And by that I mean brain damaged. So here is the most powerful position in the world, in a way, a most powerful position in a nation. How can people get there, and why? Another interesting finding I came across had to do with how many political leaders, prior to coming to power, had demonstrated their physical prowess as a way of gaining power. They were involved in wars, coups, rebellions. Along the way, they were jailed for demonstrations, things along these lines. So part of the process of becoming a ruler for many, many countries had to do with demonstrating some type of physical prowess, some type of courage, some type of heroic behavior. Why? Why would that be necessary rather than wisdom, accomplishments in certain areas, business, the arts? Why did having military accomplishment, why was that so important? Another puzzling finding had to do with, as I looked at many of the rulers, I was struck in many countries with how many women they consorted with. For example, how many wives they had compared to others, how many children they produced. Oh my goodness. Well, let me tell you this, that the Ashanti, because they did not want to distract their leader too much, imposed a limit that the king could only have 3,333 wives. Now that was supposed to, with just that, I mean, my goodness, sometimes with one wife or two wives, that is enough to distract most people. But when you put a limit of 3,300 on somebody, that says something. Another king was King Mutesa, I believe, had supposedly 7,000 wives. The ones that most heard of during the 20th century, well, let me think. The well, during the 20th century, there's King Sabuzo of Swaziland in the 20th century, I believe, had wives in the 60s, 70s, something of that nature. I know that he had over 500 children. I guess simply put, I looked at every possible source I could. I looked at every bit of biographical information. I looked at, I think along the way, I read over 1,200 biographies over about an 18-year span. So this study was done over about 18 years. I had it completed before they did it, yes. I did not have any commitment for publication prior to having completed the study in the book. I believe that this is the most comprehensive, complete study on human rulers that's ever been done. It has more information about political leaders than any other book I've encountered. And my hope with it all is, aside from the thesis that I developed to explain a lot of their behavior, that in my last chapter in the book is titled Warmongers and Peacemakers. It's my deep hope that people can look at this and study it and look at alternative ways to stop war and stop aggression. One of the things that struck me along the way was how much aggression, how much violence there has been, not only over time, in the 20th century. I've asked other people to make estimates about the numbers of death. They don't even come close. There have been, as a result of either wars started by these leaders or disastrous social policies initiated by these leaders, over 200 million deaths in the 20th century. That, to me, is shocking and frightening, and particularly as we develop even more powerful weapons of destruction. That is correct. Yes, I say it's a good sign. However, I do make the caution. I do, in the book, talk about different types of democracy. What certain people mean by democracy is not necessarily what you might mean or what I would mean by democracy. I believe it is a good sign. It's a good sign for a number of reasons. What I found in my studies was that dictators, as compared to democratic leaders, were far more likely to be involved in war than democratic leaders. I believe 74% of all dictators had been involved in some type of war, civil rebellion, something, during their term in office. That's compared to 37% of democratic leaders, twice as many. Still too much. 37% is an awful lot, but it's half of what you might find among dictators. Well, first, let me put those numbers in context. Those numbers are not engraved in stone. I would say that probably that if you wanted to group people, you'd take maybe a 5 to 7 point swing and include them kind of all together. It just so happened that Ataturk did come out first. Why Ataturk? The political greatness scale, I guess I need to say a word about that, if I may, first. Yes. I didn't want to invent it. When I first started the study, I was looking for some type of measure to evaluate political greatness. As I mentioned before, I was puzzled about this phenomenon, and I looked to others. I looked to political scientists. I searched the literature. I could not find any actual scale that measured political greatness cross-culturally. Of course, people rated the American presidents or this kind of thing, but nothing cross-culturally. So then the question came to me, how do you go about evaluating what is political greatness? And then I had a kind of eureka experience. Well, why not look at those people who were acknowledged by almost everyone as being great political leaders? Who are the famous names in history over time that come to mind when somebody says, mention a great political leader? People who come to mind are people like Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Alexander the Great, Bismarck, the immortals, the political immortals, Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, people along those lines. And I came up with 26 of those people. Okay, these, I think almost everybody would say, these are the political immortals. And then I asked the question, what do these immortals have in common? Are there any common denominators? And lo and behold, I found a number of common denominators. Almost every single one of them had these characteristics. And I then used these characteristics, 11 of them, in developing the political greatness scale, and tested the scale in terms of its reliability, in terms of its validity. It was interesting that the scale correlated extremely highly with the amount of words allotted to these individuals in the Encyclopedia Britannica or the Encyclopedia Americana. So it had a validity to it. So this is the political greatness scale, 11 items on it. One item, unfortunately, several of them have to do with conquests, unfortunately. But this is how people evaluate political greatness. Military victories, more territory, social engineering, changing the very nature of the society, economic prosperity, being a moral exemplar in a way, people like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, for example. No, it has to do with accomplishments, political achievement. Yes, I think it's an excellent kind of comparison. By greatness, I mean nothing about how you feel toward the, do you admire this person? I mean, some of these people are despicable. They're horrible people. However, their achievements, political achievements, are monumental. Why William McKinley? A lot of people don't realize that William McKinley was quite an activist president. He was, he secured the Philippines for the Americans. He helped liberate Cuba. There were many things that he did that actually on this political greatness scale scored him, gave him higher points than some of the other kind of presidents. I might mention, too, that as you rank them, if you were to look at those rankings compared to some of the rankings that have been given for presidents of the 20th century, you would find a very high correlation. It's surprising how close that is to what others have independently come up with on I don't know what kind of measures. It means not only did nothing happen, it means that there was corruption. They often ended their time in disgrace. Very short while. Yes, yes. And that's another criterion. How long are they in office in terms of as to whether or not they will achieve greatness, how they'll score on this political greatness scale. Let's look at what Ataturk did. And again, mind you, take this in the context of some of the other great leaders that some of the immortals I mentioned. Ataturk started Turkey. He dismantled the Ottoman Empire, which was in existence at the time. He not only was the founder of the country, creating a country, but he caused a profound social change in Turkey. He introduced democracy into Turkey, somewhat a militant type of democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. He was one of the first time in history to kind of separate church and state. In fact, even though it is predominantly a Muslim country, it's one of the few ones where certain types of freedoms are permitted, and in fact, the military is obliged to intervene if there's any threat to the democracy in any way. So at every single level, Ataturk had an incredible effect, and his achievements were remarkable. About 1950, up till about 1950, something like that. Well, I introduce it. I do try to introduce a bit of humor throughout the book to make the facts a lot more palatable. I said that people are supposed to grow in office, and certainly King Farouk did in every way. And I called him Little Farouki. He was a brat and pampered, and I might say here is a leader of the country, and he is supposed to uphold the faith in the country. For my information, he never really read the Koran. He never read a newspaper he never read a book. He almost had people go to school for him to digest the information beforehand. And I guess I introduced him for the reason I am not overall too fond of the kings that I have encountered in the 20th century. And yes, Austria, Habsburg, Franz Joseph, 68 years. Thank you. 68 years. That is an excellent question. Persistence. He was a very unimaginative person. I do mention that he had a rather unique political and military strategy when he went to war, and he went to war a number of times. He would usually concede or give up before his country lost, and then once he gave up, he would then try to start rebellions. There are all kinds of weird things with him. A tyrant was somebody who went into office and essentially ruled the country for power and perks predominantly. Usually military rule, oppression. Oh gosh, I can name a number. Duvalier in Haiti, Papadoc Duvalier. I think we have one now in the Middle East, in Iraq. Yes. A visionary is someone whose ostensible reason in office or in being a leader is to transform the country according to his vision. And I say his because they're all men here. And for example, Mao transformed an entire nation into this communist image and his own notion of communism. Stalin did that. He was a visionary. Authoritarian would be someone who is not necessarily holding office for his own gains, but who believes in law and order, who believes in the country. Juan Perón, for example, would have been an authoritarian leader. Authoritarian leaders were some of the, what I call the apparatchiks, the bureaucratic leaders in the Soviet Union who came after Stalin and so forth, whose purpose was to maintain stability in the country, who were dedicated. Khrushchev was close to, he had some visionary notions as well, but he was pretty close, combination visionary apparatchik. A transitional is someone who changes the entire nature of the country or who brings a new country into existence. For example, De Valera in Ireland helped create the country of Ireland. I would say Nelson Mandela would be considered a transitional. He helped change the nature of apartheid to a more democratic form of government and a new form of government. So a radical type of change, either from, or independence. Nehru would be a transitional in India. With difficulty, but it was there. It required some investigative work. I also happen to have worked with an excellent person, Greg Gunther, who was my research assistant then, and he was excellent at ferreting out a lot of this information. Yes, I was. Well, I came into this study. I did have a bit of awe toward political leaders, awe and scorn, probably a combination of both. But somehow I did not anticipate and expect this much mental, emotional type of problems among them. The amount of mania, the frank craziness of many of them, the paranoia was rampant, often severe. And again, I was astounded to find that there would be that many. And in fact, in the book, I almost wondered whether being depressed is one of the criteria for becoming a British Prime Minister. Certainly, Winston Churchill, well, he really set the tone. I mean, his depression, in many instances, was incapacitating. Almost all, did not take advantage of psychiatric help. Certainly, either they could not admit it, or their advisors or whomever felt that would not be politically advantageous for that to become known. Winston Churchill, his main way of handling what he called the black dog that would come over him was painting. He used that as a type of way of lifting his spirits. Others treated their depression kind of by themselves. They drank, many. Some took, I think Macmillan it was, took amphetamines and became hooked on them. All of the behaviors most of the behaviors we're talking about, and most that I do develop and describe what I call the primate model of ruling. And what I do is not only, I want to demonstrate that particular picture, for example. I wanted to demonstrate that among gorillas, too, you see the sense of presence that you find in many rulers, the sense of charisma, in a way. You wonder, where does charisma develop from? Well, you can see this in a number of the primates. That's a wonderful one. I do want to point that out, that, again, looking for parallels with chimps and so forth, that particular chimp is attacking an imaginary image. He's attacking the mirror image of himself in the mirror. So I also use that to illustrate that a number of rulers began coming up and generating enemies from nowhere. Look for enemies, as this chimp apparently is doing. Okay, that's a very young chimp in the San Diego Zoo, and he's beating his breast. I'm going to be big someday. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to be a leader. I'm going to dominate. And he's getting in practice for the dominance struggle. Yes, yes. Well, let's start with the last question you asked first, Mr. Lamb. You asked, and that is, I was particularly interested in knowing if I could find any common pattern in some of the mass murders of the 20th century, some of the people who have committed the most horrendous acts, people like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, who was the fifth one? There was another one. And so I looked in some depth at their childhood. And although they were disturbed in different ways, and a lot of them had difficulties with their father in particular, and they got into trouble in some ways, I could not come up with any convincing findings that I could say this was the root of their later becoming these monsters that they later became. I could not find it. And the conclusion I came to as a result of this, and with a number of the other leaders as well, is that something very important takes place, some transformation takes place as one gains ultimate power. That the very process of gaining ultimate power changes the nature of the person, changes the way they look at the world, changes the way they look at themselves, so forth. That, you know, the old saying that almost everybody knows is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I believe there's a lot of truth to that. A number of them were cruel, a number were not necessarily. I mean, Idi Amin, for example, was former head of Uganda, was a British officer, and he was sort of thought of very highly. He liked to put on performances. He amused people. He was a seemingly delightful person. He got power. It changed dramatically. And there are many other instances that with increasing power, changes begin taking place in the way they relate to themselves and others. Well, certainly the whole process of, in a number of countries where to gain ultimate power, all kinds of, let's say, less than forthright or honest behavior takes place, where promises are made that aren't kept, where people, you know, there's an expectation for a certain amount of lying or manipulation of the public takes place, where, yes, oh, absolutely, you get it in every society. Absolutely, I sure do. I like to think independent, and I don't want to commit myself because I want a lot of people to buy the books. I believe under the section, under the chapter in which I talk about the childhoods of the various rulers, I pick one example to illustrate each type of leader, one for a monarch, one for a tyrant, and I picked Richard Nixon to illustrate a established democratic leader. Many of the people, in terms of the childhood characteristics of a number of the democratic leaders, I found were outgoing, were charming, were often athletic, popular. They had a more effusive type of personality. From what I was able to gather about Nixon as a child, he was not well liked. He was persnickety. He did not like to get too close to people, didn't want to touch them. And yet, with all of these characteristics, unusual characteristics for the Democratic leaders, where you need a popular vote, he was remarkable in the sense that he, through persistence and thoughtfulness, cunning, whatever you want to call it, was able, growing up, to get in progressively into one leadership position after another. He, whatever organization he was in, he moved to the head of it through diligence, hard work, application, and so forth. And amazingly, even prior to becoming president, I think a lot of people were surprised that he ran, and even more so that he won. Yes, I have a lot of information from his doctor. I have information from others who have researched this in great detail. This is not firsthand on my part, but I put together this information. I like to think I describe some delightful anecdotes, interesting anecdotes there about a number of these leaders. But in his case, he was so revered and there was a period of time that he was very constipated, and he would have workers have his devoted following if he could not have a bowel movement. They would dig out the constipated feces. And there were times that when he was able to do it on his own, that people rejoiced that he has had a bowel movement. They were actually so rejoiceful about it. It did get on that that changed over time. I think he was helped where somebody developed or devised the kind of stool that he could sit on in a way that would facilitate things. Now, what? Well, okay. The way you revere him, and what I describe when you say it doesn't read well, is that he played up. I think this is what you're getting at. He played up the peasant image, and he exploited it. There was he had a kind of perverse sense of humor too. For example, there was a instance of a female reporter, interviewing him, and while she was doing it, he was reaching in his clothes and down, picking off lice off of his body, and that was it created a kind of revulsion toward him, and yet he seemed to delight in doing this, in keeping people off balance in a way. But I think much of what you're describing has to do with playing up the peasant image, which was very important for him. Even though he played it up, what a lot of people didn't realize is that he took full advantage of his prerogatives. He would have swimming parties with nude women, all kind of young women swimming around, gambling around in the water, and he had one of the finest collections of erotic literature in the world. He had all of the prerogatives of ultimate power, but he liked to play up this peasant image and upset people. Oh my goodness, let's see. Well, yeah, the answer is yes. There certainly were a number of moral exemplars, people who I think were very admirable. Offhand, I can't list a number of them, but one would come to mind would be, I would think that I couldn't find very much in Jimmy Carter's past that would be negative. I think that he was honest. He struggled with his feelings, but he did not. I think he tried to do a good job. Harry Truman, yes, Harry Truman, I think would be. I would say thank you. Theodore Roosevelt as well. Ronald Reagan as well. Yes. All of them have been social engineers, have changed the nature of society by introducing various types of legislation that change the way we function in society, that have changed the nature of civil rights, for example. All of them have been victorious in war, which again is an important consideration. It's interesting that no American president, hardly any president at all, or any leader at all, has achieved political greatness without being involved in some type of military engagement. What I claim is that and making sense out of all this behavior is that there is a tendency, a biological and social drive for, particularly in men, to achieve dominance within a political structure in a society. Eventually, those who do get to the top become king of the mountain, who eventually do get to the top, usually are alpha males. Alpha males in the sense that they show a lot of the characteristics of alpha male chimps, gorillas, baboons, and so forth. What are those characteristics? I found in my studies, in my book, that the more power these leaders have, the more likely they are to have extramarital affairs or harems, the more likely they are to have larger broods, more children. This is the same thing alpha males among other primates have. The more likely they are to have special access to food and shelter, but by that I mean more likely to build up fortunes and be taken care of for the rest of their life. And the other important thing is alpha males expect submission, expect people to treat them with deference. And that's part of becoming an alpha male and the drive to become an alpha male. And all of these leaders also do that. In fact, the more power one has, the more likely one is to form a personality cult to ensure that people defer and even worship them. Yes, you could, Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir are a couple of examples. I believe they're remarkable people that they were able to do that, but it's kind of interesting. I also point out in my book that most of these women are referred to in masculine terms. They're, for example, I can't use, I'm concerned about using the word on television. They've got what men have, and they know how to kick butt. They're described with masculine types of traits. It's also interesting that even though they've gained power, that their cabinets are most all men, that the leaders of the military are all men, that at every level below when women are there, they're not women who start filling in these slots. All their advisors still are men. But again, you're right. These are remarkable women. It dawned on me that that's what it's all about. King of the mountain, the striving for dominance, the striving to be on top. Oh my goodness, not very many, I fear. I think they started out with 4,000. Something like $30, but I think some of the discount places are down about $22, $24, something like that. Whew. I feel very good about it. I really hope that it does catch on, not for personal interests. I mean, I don't need the money, I don't need the finances, so forth, but I'm concerned about the implications. warmongers, peacemakers. I hope people will read the book and use some of these insights in terms of stopping some of the violence, in being able to create a more effective peace. Ooh, my goodness. I liked Teddy Roosevelt. I thought he was interesting, and I did like Ataturk. I thought was fascinating. Yes, thank you. My pleasure.